4th chapter of the book of Esther. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went throughout the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her the queen was deeply distressed, she sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend to her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat him on behalf of her people. Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message from Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all of the other Jews. For if you keep silent at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, although it is against the law. And if I perish, then I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Our second reading comes from the 7th and 9th chapters of the book of Esther. So this is the text that is appointed for this Sunday as the Older Testament reading by the Revised Common Lectionary. Sort of the conclusion of the story. From Esther's chapter 7 and 9. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition. And the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who has presumed to do this? Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. Mordecai recorded all these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month, year by year, as the day on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another, and presents to the poor. Brothers and sisters, grace and peace to you all in the name of our still-speaking God, who loves us just the way that we are, and who loves us too much to let us stay that way. Will you pray with me? May these words of my mouth and may the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, for it is you, and you alone, who is our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I already said once this morning that I don't really want to preach a sermon so much as tell a story this morning. We're going to tell the story of Queen Esther, as is recorded in the Bible. So our story is a Bible story. And as such, it was written long ago. And we need to start this story by saying that it was written at a time when people had very different attitudes about women and the way that men relate to women, about slavery and the way that one person could own another. Very different attitudes than we have today. Attitudes that we rightly would condemn today. And specifically, I need to start this story by saying that some of the women in this story are not treated well. This is a story that contains stories of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Statistics tell us that the experience of sexual harassment in this country is almost universal among women, and that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 70 men will be sexually assaulted at some point in their lives. That means that statistically, there are probably a number of people in the room today who are survivors of sexual violence. And I need to start this story by saying, if that's you, then I acknowledge you, and I am sympathetic towards your experience. And I know that you are probably feeling really raw right now, because stories of sexual violence have been in the news for, certainly a lot in recent weeks and in the past couple of years. This has been something that is coming up over and over again. And you're probably feeling really raw right now. And so I just want to start by letting you know that this is a part of our story this morning. And if you need to take a break, if you need to step out, if you need to take out your smartphone and start looking at Facebook and just kind of zone out what I am saying, that's fine. I understand that impulse. You please take care of yourself however you need to. Okay? So this morning we're going to hear the story of Queen Esther. But at the beginning of the story, Queen Esther is not yet a character in the story. Our story begins with King Ahasuerus. And King Ahasuerus is not a very good king. King Ahasuerus kind of represents the worst in what monarchy can be, right? This is a man who has inherited a great deal of wealth and a great deal of power from the accomplishments of his forefathers, but he himself is not a particularly good king, as some of his forefathers had been. He is vain, he is petty, he just wants to celebrate and party with all of this wealth and power that he has inherited through no merit of his own. And not only is he a vain and petty king, he is indecisive. He makes poor decisions. And so he has surrounded himself with advisors, but these advisors are likewise vain and petty men who just want to celebrate the wealth and power that they have. They have no particular interest in serving the greater good of their kingdom. King Ahasuerus is not a good king. And King Ahasuerus, he wants to celebrate, he wants to show off all of the wealth and power that he has. And so he decides that there is going to be a celebration to last 180 days in his kingdom. And during this celebration, they pull out all the stops, right? All of the wealth and the power, the opulence, the privilege of King Ahasuerus and his contemporaries. It is on display for the entire kingdom to see. It's the finest silks and garments, the finest foods and wines. It is a celebration of his wealth. And this 180-day party that King Ahasuerus wants to have, it culminates with a 7-day-long feast. They are going to feast non-stop for 7 days, right? I mean, you've probably seen images of this in some of the old movies that they have of Roman empires. Everybody just parties until they pass out drunk right there in the feast hall, and then they wake up in the feast hall and start over, right? 7-day-long feast. And at the end of this 7-day-long feast, King Ahasuerus, he is good and wasted by this point. The Bible explicitly says that he is in a high spirit with wine. That's the exact wording of Scripture. So King Ahasuerus is toasted. And King Ahasuerus gets it in his head that as he has been showing off all of the wealth and opulence and power that he, as the king of the greatest empire in the world, has, the one thing that he hasn't shown off is his queen, Queen Vashti. Queen Vashti, the Scriptures tell us, was one of the most beautiful women in the world. Just completely beautiful in every way that you can imagine. And as far as the king is concerned, she is just another one of his possessions to be showed off. And so on the 7th day of this 7-day-long feast, when the king is good and inebriated, he calls for Queen Vashti to be brought into the feast hall wearing her crown. The Bible is not explicit on this point, but the ancient rabbis who studied the book of Esther, those ancient rabbis of the Jewish faith, They say that the implication here, when the king asks for Vashti to be brought into the feast hall wearing her crown, the implication is that she is to be brought in the feast hall wearing only her crown. Right? This king has been showing off for his friends for 180 days. Every beautiful possession that he has, and as far as he is concerned, Vashti is just one more possession for him to show off. So the king asks for one of the eunuchs to go and fetch Vashti to bring her into the feast hall wearing only her crown, so that he can show her off to all of his friends. Y'all know what a eunuch is? Tell you, whatever else you think of Game of Thrones, one of the best things about that show is that so many more people know what eunuchs are than they used to. So a eunuch is a castrated male, right? They are the servants of royalty. And the king employs the eunuch because the king knows that the eunuchs can be trusted around the queen. The eunuchs no longer have what is necessary for them to have to cheat on, to be physically with the queen. They're castrated. So the king sends one of his eunuchs to bring Vashti to the feast hall wearing only her crown, and Vashti refuses. She says, I will not go. I will not come. She refuses to be degraded in this way. And so King Ahasuerus, who is not a very good king, and who has surrounded himself with advisors who are not very good advisors, he asks his advisors to come to him. And he says to them, what is it? What are we going to do about Queen Vashti? She's refusing to come. She's refusing to answer my summons. What are we going to do about this? And his advisors say to him, this cannot be allowed. If Queen Vashti can refuse to come before you in this way, then other women will hear about this. And they too will begin to defy their husbands. This is exactly what their concern is. Feel free to look this up. This is Esther chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. That is their concern, is that if Vashti can refuse to be objectified in this way, and their wives hear about it, then their wives might pretty soon start refusing to be objectified in this way. And that's going to be a problem for these men. So they say, this cannot be allowed. We can't let this happen. And so the king passes a law that explicitly states that husbands are the masters of their wives, and that husbands may do with them and to them whatever they please. And then Queen Vashti is banished from Persia. She is thrown out of the kingdom, penniless, given nothing to go with her. She is thrown out on her own with nothing. But she does so with her dignity. It's interesting, right? This is the story of the book of Esther. We're only in the introduction to Esther's story, but already our story has a heroine, has a hero. I wish more girls were being named Vashti. So now, the king, he has banished his queen, and he finds himself without a queen. And he has to figure out how he is going to replace his queen. And so, our not-so-good king Ahasuerus gathers his not-so-good counselors. And he says, what am I going to do? I don't have a queen anymore. And his counselors suggest this. We should search for a new queen. You should have representatives go throughout all the countryside. Go to all of the cities throughout the kingdom. Search everywhere. And have your representatives round up every really beautiful woman that they can find. And all of these beautiful women that your men find should be brought back here to the capital, to the palace, where some of your eunuchs can give them beauty treatments, can do their hair and their makeup, get them really looking good for you. And then you can try each one of these women for one night. One after the other, you can try each of these women for one night. And whichever one you find the most satisfactory, make that one the new queen. King Ahasuerus thinks this is a good idea. So his men are sent throughout the empire of Persia to round up every beautiful woman that they can find. And one of the women is named Esther. A Jewish girl living in Persia. Most of the Jews have returned to their country by this time, but some of the Jews remained in Persia after the captivity. Esther and her family are among them. And she's beautiful. And for Esther, this turns out to be a curse. Because she's pretty enough that the king's men grab her along with many, many other women and bring her back, where she, like many other women, is given a try for a night by the king. And she is the one who pleases the king best. And so it is Esther who is made the queen of Persia. It is important for you to understand what it means to be the queen of Persia. This is just one of many partners that the king has. She just happens to be his favorite. But she is just one member of the king's harem, right? The king has many women that he keeps in the palace. Esther just happens to be his favorite. So this is not a marriage in the sense that you and I understand the term today when we think of marriage, right? This is not a union that is formed in mutual care and concern and love, in which both people owe one another respect and support and love. To be the queen just means that she is the most favored member of the harem. She is not given a whole lot of respect by King Ahasuerus. There is not a great deal of intimacy between the two of them. In fact, you'll recall from our scripture reading that when Mordecai finally comes to her, it's been 30 days since she last saw her husband. Esther is brought to the palace to be tried for a night by the king, along with many other women. Today we would call this rape. That would be the word that we would use. There is no consent given. There is no choice in the matter for Esther, nor for any of these other women. So Esther is made queen. And meanwhile, among those very poor advisors of the king, there is one named Haman. And Haman, he really hates the Jewish people in general, and he really hates Mordecai, Esther's cousin, in particular. And Haman, he comes up with this plan to get rid of the Jews and to get rid of Mordecai. Haman goes to the king, because Haman is basically the second in command. He's effectively the prime minister of Persia. So he is able to go before the king, and he says to the king, "Your Majesty, there are people who are living in this country right now who do not fit in. They are foreigners living in this country, and they have not really integrated into our society. These foreigners living among us, they keep their own customs, they worship their own gods. They haven't really become a part of our culture. And worst of all, these foreigners living in your country, they have no respect for you. They don't respect you. I think that we need to get rid of these people. And King Ahasuerus is not a very good king. He tends to do whatever his advisors tell him. And so the king agrees with Haman. And the king signs a decree that on the 13th day of the month of Adar, all of the Jews in Persia are to be killed. The decree goes out. When Mordecai learns of this, he is in mourning. He's shaken to his core. I mean, there's a death sentence on him and his entire family and his entire people. And there's really not a whole lot that he can do about it. Can you imagine the fear that he must have been experiencing? The anxiety, knowing that there has been a date scheduled for you and all of your people to be killed. So, Mordecai, as Jews do in time of repentance, in times of turning to God, he puts on sackcloth and ashes. He begins mourning. He wanders throughout the streets in sackcloth and ashes, beating his breast, weeping and mourning. And as he passes by the palace, Esther gets word that her cousin Mordecai is in sackcloth and ashes and mourning and wailing, and she sends one of the eunuchs. She sends Hathach out to comfort Mordecai and to get him to put on his clothes and to wash his face, but he refuses. And he sends Hathach back to Esther with a message, telling her what has happened. She doesn't even know. She's trapped inside that palace. Has no idea that this decree has gone out. And Mordecai asks Esther for help. Please, will you go before your husband and beg for the lives of your family and your people? And Esther sends back her reply through one of the eunuchs, but she can't leave the palace. And Mordecai is not allowed, no man who isn't a eunuch is allowed to come into the harem. So they use Hathach as this go-between, and he goes back from Mordecai to Esther, and Esther gets this message, and she wants Hathach to reply to Mordecai, there's nothing I can do. The king hasn't summoned me for 30 days. And if I go before the king now, without being summoned, I risk death. There's nothing I can do. Hathach goes and delivers the message to Mordecai, and Mordecai's reply comes back to Esther. If you can't save us, nobody can. And maybe, just maybe, you have come into the position that you are now in for such a time as this. The first thing that I want to say about what Mordecai says to Esther is that is incredibly insensitive. Isn't it? He is basically saying, maybe being taken, being effectively kidnapped from your home and brought before the king in order to serve him sexually, maybe somehow that's all a part of some grand design, a part of some plan. Maybe you have come to your position for such a time as this. I think it's incredibly insensitive of Mordecai. I also think that in some way, it might be true. Not that God has actually caused this sequence of events to happen. Not that God is responsible. But I think what Mordecai is getting